Yes, our last speaker is Aneirin Pendragon. They are an independent scholar currently working at the Penn Museum at the University of Pennsylvania and currently awaiting PhD application decisions. Good luck. The title of their talk is "We Are All Actually Islands: Syncretic Practices in Contemporary Hellenic Polytheism." They hold an MA in Classical Studies from Villanova University, an MA in Museum Studies from the University of Oklahoma, and BAs in History Classics and English Creative Writing from the University of Delaware. They create videos in their spare time for their YouTube channel, which has a wonderful name, The Ancient Greco-Roman. I love that. To share their love of the ancient world in an informal and accessible way. Thank you so much. Over to you, Aneirin.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? And an update, I was accepted to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, so I will be going there.
Oh, congrats, congrats. I really wish you all the best, Aneirin.
Thank you. All right, so I don't actually have a screen to share, but I will be reading my presentation to you, and most of it is just going to be the analysis of the survey because it will be taking about that much time to go over everything. So again, hello everyone. As everyone has already said, I'd like to thank the Multi-Classics Association for putting on this awesome conference and including me and the wonderful panelists. I'm very excited to talk about my research with you all. My presentation is about how the culture of individuals, whether it be personal culture, subculture, or counterculture, affects and forms how they approach reconstructing the ancient Greek religion for contemporary practice. I've previously approached this idea similar in my first master's program in 2016, when I explored how the internet influenced the resurgence of contemporary polytheist religions. That particular project focused on internet culture as a whole, but I wanted to focus on the cultures of individual people instead in this presentation. So many contemporary polytheists, especially those who convert later in life, take the beliefs they already have and mesh them with ancient Greek religion in the other direction because they start with themselves rather than religion. So if the religion had continued throughout history, would it not be historically accurate to incorporate beliefs that make people who they are? The focus of this presentation will be to assess how contemporary Hellenic polytheists conceptualize syncretic practices and to determine whether they adhere to what some may claim as historically accurate syncretism, or if they're more flexible with this aspect, if they even incorporate it at all. So the ancient Greek religion was not static or homogeneous, so how could anyone claim to be historically accurate by adhering to a static version of the ancient Greek religion encapsulated in an approved date range by those who claim authority over the religion, such as organized groups such as Hellenic in the United States? Would it not be more historically accurate to continue the tradition of not being static while worshiping the same gods, perhaps in different ways like they did in the polis? One may argue that the most historically accurate thing would be to worship what makes the best sense to you while keeping the same base pantheon, although the base pantheon has evolved over time as well. Each polis worshipped the same gods in different manners. So how does one determine which practice is to be utilized in a historically accurate way? Does the practitioner have to choose, or does each polis, as they may create, to adhere to a predetermined region, such as Athens? Additionally, how would this differ with contemporary practitioners who have varying private and personal practices that they adhere to in their own household? So that concept is everyone is their own little island of culture, or an amalgamation of cultures that make up who they are as a person. And so the Greek colony now comes to them individually through the gods. So how does that change or not change the approach of personal religion or public, if applicable? I was originally going to run a short-term survey for about a month to answer the above questions, but due to some unforeseen circumstances that kept delaying my survey to the point where there was only a week left in order to get any responses at all, I ended up using an edited down version that would exempt the survey from IRB approval after consulting with a colleague at the Penn Museum. So using her guidelines, I put out a call for participants for the survey where they would only have about a week to answer these questions. And so as there was only 9 respondents to the survey, I will be including an autoethnography pertaining to the subject matter as well, as it was as it will contextualize further what I was expecting and possibly hoping for when I distributed the survey versus the responses I actually received. I'm a contemporary Hellenic polytheist practitioner myself, and my experiences coincide with those who answered the survey. And additionally, I just wanted those answers to round up to an even 10. The questions that I asked for the survey included demographic data, and the questions pertaining to the religious practices were as follows. After inquiring what social media platforms respondents used for personal use, they were asked if they had any particular social media specifically for religious purposes, any subculture, counterculture of which they were a part and how it affected their practice, if at all. What subsection of Hellenic polytheist did they most closely identify with? This particular section was a bit lengthy and did explain that some areas might overlap, but the definitions were simplified in the interest of data collection purposes. So those options were reconstructionist, so a person who worships in a way that is as closely to historically accurate as possible. Revivalist uses the historical sources as guidelines, but is more flexible on their practices and beliefs that doesn't necessarily have as a strict structure as a reconstructionist. Historic syncretic practitioner, where only recorded syncretic practices were followed, or eclectic, where the main focus is Hellenic polytheism, but other beliefs are incorporated, or they could choose other and give me an option I did not provide for them. The remaining questions were, do you incorporate any deities outside the Greek pantheon because it was part of how you grew up? Do you practice any practices from the religion you grew up in, despite identifying as a Hellenic polytheist? Does your Greek pantheon include heroes or hero worship? And if so, who? They were asked to describe how they gave offerings, libations, sacrifices, about the chthonic worship they may take part in, the way they set up their altar if they had one, if they practiced alone or with groups, about the afterlife and death, and finally, if they had anything else to add that I may have forgotten. So first, I'm going to go over the demographic data. So the majority of the respondents, of course, were from the United States, as I am also from the United States, so that was expected. 2 respondents were from California, 1 was from Delaware, 1 Massachusetts, 1 Missouri, 1 Ohio, and 2 from Texas. The remaining 2 individuals were from South Australia and Wales in the United Kingdom. And then the ages were pretty evenly split, with 3 18 to 24-year-olds, 3 25 to 34-year-olds, 2 35 to 44-year-olds, and 2 45 to 54-year-olds, and no one over 55. The gender identities included 5 cisgender women, 1 trans woman, 2 cisgender men, 1 non-binary person, and 1 person who wrote agender and woman with both followed with a question mark. So I can understand that they are probably somewhere in between. And then one of the most interesting things that I would note about the demographic data, which I'm going to touch on a little later when referring to subculture responses, is that none of the people identifying their sexuality identified as straight. Everyone completed the survey was part of the LGBTQ plus community. 5 were identified as bisexual, 2 as pansexual, 2 as lesbian, and 1 as gay. Again, this was a very small pool of respondents, but it's worth noting that my previous study with the influence of the internet on the growth of polytheist religions also had a high concentration of respondents in the LGBTQ plus community. The following question was about ethnicity, and the respondents wrote in their definitions of their own ethnicity. So 3 people said white, 1 person said Caucasian, 1 person said British, white British, 1 person said white Scots Irish and French American, and 2 people said mixed, but one of whom indicated they were white passing, and 1 person said Asian. The next question was whether the respondents identified as disabled individuals and were invited to elaborate on it if they so wished. 6 said no, 1 of whom indicated that they have a lifelong illness that, when medicated, doesn't affect their life that much. And then 4 said yes, the disabilities listed by the 3 of the people who elaborated were ADHD, autism, CPTSD, dissociative identity disorder, or DID, and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or EDS. And so then I asked about education, and the highest level of education completed by respondents was listed as 6 for high school diploma or equivalent, 1 for a bachelor's degree, and 3 for a master's degree. 3 participants work full-time at 40 hours a week. 1 is working part-time, 1 was unemployed, not looking for work. 2 were students, 1 was retired, 1 was a student working full-time, and the final respondent was a student working part-time. And then marital status was recorded as 6 single and never married, 2 married, 1 in domestic partnership, and 1 divorced. And then 3 reported household income at 10 to 30,000 USD, 1 at 30 to 50,000 USD, 3 at 50 to 70,000 USD, 1 at 70,000 to 1,000 USD, 100,000, I'm sorry, and 1 at over 100,000 USD. So then the survey is assessing which social media platforms respondents use for personal use, in which they specifically used for religious reasons, such as if they had an e-shrine on a blogging site such as Tumblr, where they dedicated it to one of the gods that people could visit digitally. The respondents each use at least 2 of the following for personal use: Discord, Facebook, Instagram, Patreon, Snapchat, TikTok, Tumblr, Twitter, WordPress, YouTube, and 1 individual indicated that they only use Facebook and Twitter for professional reasons. 2 respondents replied that they use no social media specifically for religious reasons, but the rest used at least 2 of the following, which is the same list as above, but with no WordPress. And then when we got to the section about the culture and subculture and countercultures they consider themselves a part of and how it affects and informs their worship, I am going to read each person's response verbatim in order to give a better contextualized answer as I analyze the responses. So the culture described by each one, respondent 1 says they also practice witchcraft, was hereditary pagan, and that definitely impacts my worship and information as I was exposed to it as much younger. Second respondent said, punk LGBT plus community. I find that being queer had caused me to stray away from organized religion and Christianity specifically. Respondent 3 said, goth, metal, BDSM, and paganism. The metal subculture sometimes affects my spiritual path in that I have to be super cautious of community members, groups, musics, events, which support white supremacists. At times, BDSM/sacred kink may interact with my worship in select ritual contexts. And then respondent 4 said, I've been a member of various goth communities for 20 plus years, but it doesn't overlap that much. The most I can say is that it's probably a higher proportion of people being openly pagans of any sort. Number 5 said, polyamory, not much impact. Witchcraft, definitely. I'm an initiate of Hecate. Do spell work and rituals outside the Hellenic norm in addition to regular Hellenic rites and theurgy. The number 6 answered NA as to indicate it was not applicable to them. Number 7 said, goth, I don't feel it informs my practice, but it can be another way to honor it. Number 8 said, I enjoy metal music, but I'm not really in the scene and don't incorporate it into my religious life. Number 9 said, LGBTQ plus, yes, this influences my practice. Number 9 did not elaborate in this space on how it influences their practice. And number 10 in this case is me. I am also part of the LGBTQ plus community, the disabled community, as I have DID and I'm autistic. And I am also in the witchcraft and BDSM communities as well, all above which influences how I approach, practice, worship, and reconstruct the ancient Greek religion. Next set of questions focuses on the religion and cultures specifically. 7 individuals identified as revivalists, 2 as eclectic practitioners, and 1 chose other because they were torn between choosing revivalist and eclectic, as they were currently exploring the eclectic aspect of polytheism. It is interesting to note that there were no respondents that actually chose the 2 options that were more rigid in the claim for historic accuracy. This could be because of the small sampling of respondents, but I would hypothesize that during a more extensive survey that those choices would still be the lowest percentage among respondents. The next question asks the respondents if they incorporated deities outside of the Hellenic pantheon because it was how they grew up, or if they still used practices of religions they grew up in despite identifying as the Hellenic polytheist. The example I gave on the survey, because I often describe myself as culturally Catholic, as that was the religion I grew up in, is that I will have the immediate urge to call on certain saints for assistance, such as St. Anthony for lost things, because it was a practice that was ingrained to me at a young age. 1 respondent said they only work outside of Hellenic pantheon on behalf of friends, But when they do, they have communicated with Loki, Thor, Isis, and a few others. The next said they have reverence for saints, but generally don't incorporate anything relevant to them into their practice. The next respondent indicated they worshipped many gods, which were Hellenic, but also Roman, among others, but would worship Greek gods separated from any other deity worship. The next individual said no, because they grew up as an atheist, so they had no other incorporations to add. The next respondent, I'm going to quote directly. I've synchronized Kili with Durga and Helios with Melek, Taus, and Lucifer to some degree. I grew up as an eclectic pagan witch and studied fairy, and those have some influence in ritual techniques and philosophy. Then one indicated they honor the she because they learned from an Irish family. Another quoted from a respondent is as follows: Catholic, reciting a Hail Mary in times of moral stress and fear, also keeping an ancestor altar as a Vietnamese and making offerings to them, making offerings to Vietnamese kitchen gods and ancestors at the Lunar New Year. So then the next person said they pray to Jehovah on behalf of friends or family that are Christian and Jewish because they're from an Anglican background. The final answer indicated recognizing Catholic saints as well. Note that each answer has indicated a syncretic practice of some kind, including utilizes another person's religion in prayer or worship in order to assist friends or family with ritual or hardship of some sort. One of the other syncretic practices, one of the other aspects of syncretic worship indicated that it does include hero worship that I apologize. One indicated that it doesn't include any hero worship that didn't ascend like Heracles due to their strong distaste for heroes, namely Theseus and Odysseus. The heroes specifically mentioned by those who responded are Achilles, the Amazons, Asclepius, Dioscuri, and Heracles, the last of whom was mentioned most frequently in the responses. One person inquired if I would consider ancestor veneration under this category, and I think that in a revised edition of the survey, I will have a separate question regarding ancestor veneration, as that is a practice that is present in many cultures, but utilizes different customs in the way that the ancestors are honored. And then the next section asked about how they made offerings to deities and whether personal culture played a role. And these examples I gave for the question is how I gave libations of water when I lived in the desert, because it was a more precious liquid than anything else I would have. And the food offerings I gave were often Polish food, as these are what I grew up in around, and it was most precious to me. Many of the respondents gave examples that would have been expected, such as wine, honey, water, seashells, roses, bread, fruit, frankincense, and so on. The variations indicated that financial restrictions and location dictated what was able to be given to the gods, such as offering dried plants and flowers from the area in which the person lives, because that person loves those particular plants. And that is transferred into their offering, which they view as more precious than purchased herbs. One respondent wrote, I offer primarily tea because that's what I drink most of the time. I don't offer food because I'm not happy with the disposal methods available to me, and in parentheses wrote the trash can. The respondents have all indicated they adjust their worship depending on where they live and what they have available to them, a few of which incorporate local staples, which would not have been present in ancient Greece, but what nourishes the people around whom they live now. The ways in which respondents described the chthonic gods was similar in adjustment. The individual from South Australia indicated that because the ground is incredibly tough, so burying offerings is not often an option, they leave flowers to dry and wilt instead as an offering. One said they buried offerings near a tree, but that option is not always available. One indicated that they do most cult practices at home, so they don't bury offerings often. Another said they had no good means to dispose of chthonic offerings, so they don't offer them as much as they would like. One indicated that they had land in which to bury offerings as needed. 3 others also have land and put offerings in their garden, a dug trench in the west, or in a furrow near their house. The final respondent said they did not honor these gods in a Hellenic style, but in the shamanic tradition in which they are trained. And then the question which inquires about the way the respondents orient their altar and whether anything dictates how, if they follow the Greek tradition of facing east, gave an interesting result. Most respondents do not orient their altars this way. The most common reason is that they are utilizing the spaces they can, so the altar will go where it fits in the home, followed by those whose main areas of worship is either in the kitchen or at the fireplace, so it's wherever those appliances are in the house, because you can't move that stove or that fireplace anywhere else. It's where it is. One individual has a portable altar, as they are not out about being a polytheist, so they set it up wherever is convenient when worshiping. The majority of respondents indicated that they did not believe the orientation of the altar was as important as having a space at which to worship. As long as the gods are getting something from them and they in return receive something, the altar facing east is not a requirement, according to these respondents. All respondents indicated that they were either solitary practitioners, but would worship with small groups or groups of friends who were not necessarily Hellenic polytheists, but in another sect of polytheism. Some respondents replied that they gave more and more elaborate offerings on what would be considered traditional holidays or festivals, while a few others say it's not the same without full community in which to celebrate something like a festival and express distress over the lack of community in which to do so. One individual also reported that they had participated in online rituals and festivities, but was, for the most part, a solitary practitioner. This again is an adaptation that has to be made. There are no hereditary priests watching over a local sanctuary one might travel to in order to worship a particular god, but an event can be held online and a digital congregation could gather in order to do the same type of ritual. The question immediately after asked if any of them practiced with an organized group such as Hellenic in the United States, but the majority of respondents said no. One indicated they left Hellenic due to their strict Reconstructionist approach, which is stifling to them, and another practices with their heathen kindred, and they are ordained within the Fellowship of Isis, but do not participate in group events. The contemporary polytheists of today build their community externally. However, a majority of them worship alone or with immediate family. The two most common responses when asked about the afterlife are that of reincarnation and the influence that Plato had on their view of the afterlife. Immediately following that, a couple of respondents indicated that they either did not believe in life after death at all, or weren't sure how they felt about the subject. The other respondents indicated that living well was what the focus should be and that death was just a natural part of life. One in particular indicated that the only relevance their subculture had on the beliefs about after death is that the Gothic subculture views the macabre as beautiful and natural. I left the final question open to anything that the respondents might want to add about how their cultures, countercultures, or subcultures influenced any aspect that I did not touch on in my survey. One indicated that they found that in their experience, and I quote, most pagans are queer, which makes spaces feel welcoming and safe for other queer individuals. This is also something that I have had someone express to me in my previous research, and that seems to be a common theme. Another respondent indicated that their approach in witchcraft is a little off the beaten path of mainstream Hellenic polytheism. And then one said their culture is affected greatly by contemporary politics, especially feminism, LGBTQ+ rights, and environmentalism. This particular individual also stated, it doesn't make sense to be exclusively historically accurate or to put parts of your subculture aside for spirituality. It should all work together. The final respondent said, and I want to quote this also verbatim, I believe the Hellenic gods belong to the world and that they accept everyone regardless of background, of style, or worship, and as long as your heart is pure. The conclusion here is that even with a small sampling of respondents, it is accurate to say that there is always some type of syncretic practice taking place within those who are contemporary polytheists. They adjust for their local areas in which they live, their spaces that they make their home. They pray to the gods of friends and family of times of need and may incorporate the cultures that make them who they are into their religious practice. Had Hellenic polytheism continued without interruption, perhaps we would have a way in which to see what would have been historically accurate. But I think the ways in which contemporary practitioners worship now display the same malleable and adaptable spirit of what we know about how the ancient Greek religion functioned. Cultures are not something we can separate from ourselves, and in turn, those who are contemporary Greek polytheists are adding that culture within themselves and in another structure on their island. Thank you for listening.